they basically suck it up in their bodies. And that's what becomes the trauma. That's what makes it a trauma. So if you experience something really scary, but you had a lot of support, you had empathic witnesses to be there with you, to hold you, to give you safe space, you're not going to hold that energy in your body as much as somebody who didn't have that safe space. And somebody that doesn't have that safe space, or doesn't have the people to witness them, or doesn't have the resources, and who feels alone, and their nervous systems are alone in this environment or event, whatever it is.
Hi, all. This is Vanessa from the future, and I just wanted to do a quick interjection here just to give a quick warning of the upcoming recording here. Basically, I stumbled a bit on my questions and the points that I was trying to get across because this was one of my earlier first recordings that I did. And just being kind of rusty with being able to record, and also live on video was a little bit nerve-wracking for me. So I wasn't really happy with the recording as far as how I did, how I performed, to be honest. But Nadia did really great, and everything that she answered, I really enjoyed listening to her. She offered so much depth and advice and information here. So yeah, thank you so much. So welcome back, everyone, to the Soul Rocker podcast. And I have Nadia Rae with me today, and she is a trained depth therapist. And you also do somatic work as well, right? And then you lead a group training and one-on-ones as well. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add to your introduction.
Yeah. Well, I can just go ahead and introduce myself a little bit more formally. So my name is Nadia Rae. I am a clinically trained depth-oriented therapist, which means really studying the unconscious, really studying the soul, which has been something that in Western psychology has really gotten lost and
Mm-hmm.
was really important for me. Like, I went to the most well-known depth-oriented psychology program in the United States because I was like, I just can't study cognitive behavioral therapy. Like, that's just not going to happen. I need
Mm-hmm.
more soul.
Yeah.
So I've been a therapist for 4 years and did my clinical training right after lockdown happened in 2020.
Oh,
So
wow.
that is like the time in which I learned to become a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel like if you learn to become a therapist in the midst of that much crisis, then you're pretty good.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah,
know
for
what you're
sure.
doing, hopefully.
Mhm. Mhm.
But now where I am, I live in Denver, Colorado, and I focus on depth oriented and somatic self leadership development.
Mhm.
So, what does that mean, right? I really help individuals, I help organizations, I help groups really dive into their own nervous systems, what's happening for them unconsciously, and how to bring the unconscious forward so that they can feel less like there's this monster controlling their lives, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And more like they're leading their own lives. Like, what is your authentic self wanting to show you through what symptoms are presenting? So I don't take a medical approach. I don't take a pathological approach. I see symptoms as sacred messengers that are here to show us something. And
Yeah.
it's our job to really listen to their messages in service of your soul.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Mhm.
And I'm so glad that you brought that up because that was actually one of my first questions was, can you kind of break down a little bit of what the depth trained therapist is compared to like and you mentioned even like a CBT
Mhm.
therapist, and then also like what's the difference between a counselor? Because I hear people asking this question all the time.
Yeah, sure. So depth psychology is really mystical, right? We look at dreams and the symbols of dreams. We look at metaphor, we look at imagery. We believe in synchronicity, right? We believe that the universe
Mm-hmm.
is showing us things all the time, and it's our duty to begin to really tap into the mystery of our own selves and to the universe, right? The mystery of the universe. We don't claim to, as depth therapists, we don't claim to know. We don't claim to have the answers. We don't claim to like have this scientific research that shows you that A plus B equals C, right? We believe that the soul can't be quantified, right? We believe in the limitlessness and the vastness of one's lived experience. That can feel a little bit, air quote, woo woo to
Mm-hmm.
some people in the psych field, right? And there's room for all of it, right? I'm not here to like bash CBT therapists, but the thing about most modalities in Western psychology is that they take a very cognitive approach. They take a very top down approach. So CBT is really this model of, well, change your thoughts, change your life. And for me, as a depth oriented and somatic therapist, I think that our thoughts are a byproduct of what's happening in our nervous system. And I think that our thought patterns are a byproduct of what's happening unconsciously for us, right? And we can, and this is why so many people do things like gratitude journaling or just trying to think positively, but it still doesn't work. And it's like throwing fuel on a fire, right? It's like, it just feels like gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to be true for everyone, right? But it's true for so many people that I work with is that they come to me and they say, I've gone to traditional therapy, I've talked it all out. I feel like I know what the problem is and I can't just think my way out of it. Like, what do I do? And
Mm-hmm.
what I do is help people get into their bodies, notice where the energy and where those beliefs and where those thoughts are actually stuck in your nervous system and where they're still wrapped up in something that may be unconscious to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the beauty of depth therapy. And then just in terms of like counselor versus therapist versus psychiatrist, but psychologists, right? So counselors, there are many types of counselors, right? You can have like addiction counselors, you can have school counselors. Um, Therapists sometimes call themselves counselors. It's a very vague term. It may mean that you have a clinical license as a psychotherapist. It may not mean that, right? To be a therapist or a psychotherapist, you have a master's degree and a license at a master's level. To be a psychologist, you have a license at a PhD level. And then to be a psychiatrist, you have a license at an MD level. So you're a medical doctor. So that's the difference. But counselors that maybe are actually therapists at a master's level and psychologists, they all use, and social workers actually, they all use the umbrella term psychotherapist.
Okay. Yeah. That you said it very well, and I hopefully the people can understand, because yeah, there's a lot of like gaps, and yeah, thank you for explaining that and clarifying that.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
so kind of shifting a little bit to trauma responses, like what happens in the body is not necessarily like, basically what I'm trying to say is that like a lot of the times people think that trauma is like what happens as the event. And from me even just studying, a lot of psychology myself, because I'm really interested in stuff like that. I learned that, like, oh, it's not necessarily just necessarily the event; it's more so what's happening in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And additionally, how different, basically, like, people have the different capacities to where does that even, like, actually create the trauma. For some people, you can experience something and it won't feel like it's a traumatic experience, whereas maybe other people might experience that. So, and I'm reading some notes here. Sorry that I'm like, because I want to make sure that I got everything. So the nuance factors I put on here and personal experiences, because we then are often, like, more vulnerable to experience shame rather than, like, true healing when we think about just the word trauma and, like, certain thinking of them in a sense from, like, events or what's going on in the body. So I guess my question is, I wanted to dig more into that, about, like, who also benefits on a trauma response. Does
Mm-hmm.
that make any sense of what I'm saying at all?
Yeah, I feel like there's so many questions in that, but
Yeah.
let me answer it and then you let me know
Okay.
if we need to go down even more. So you bring up a really good point around trauma, right? We just have this idea that trauma is some sort of event, right? It's like a car accident, or it's someone who got assaulted, or it's a veteran, right? But what we know in the research is that trauma is not caused by an event. What it is your nervous system's response to an event or to an environment, right? If we
Mhm.
think about CPTSD or chronic PTSD, which isn't classified as a diagnosis yet in the DSM, which I have feelings about in general, but we're
Hmm.
talking about chronic PTSD now, which is all about habitual and repeated traumatic environments, right? Not this traumatic event. And what I love about this research that's coming forward with chronic PTSD is that we're seeing that when somebody doesn't have a safe space to discharge energy, they basically suck it up in their bodies. And that's what becomes the trauma. That's what makes it a trauma. So if you experience something really scary, but you had a lot of support, you had empathic witnesses to be there with you, to hold you, to give you safe space, you're not going to hold that energy in your body as much as somebody who didn't have that safe space. And somebody that doesn't have that safe space, or doesn't have the people to witness them, or doesn't have the resources, and who feels alone, and their nervous systems are alone in this environment or event, whatever it is, then they suck that energy up. And that's what the trauma actually is. And so it's not the event, it's our response to whatever scary thing happened, whether that is a singular event or if that's a repeated event or environment that we were in. And what was your other question?
I guess because I did kind of wrap two questions into one. So you perfectly said that really well. I think that explains. Yeah, you said it in a beautiful way that really kind of explains how it unfolds. But also, like, I wanted to dig more into something that you mentioned about who benefits. You made a post on Instagram where you were talking about, like, who tends to benefit from these trauma responses. I don't know if you
Mm,
remember that
yeah.
post.
Yeah. So a trauma response is when something that's happening in the present is really triggering the past. And that can look very different depending on who is experiencing that, right? Maybe that's somebody who feels like they have to go into hiding. Maybe that's somebody that gets really angry. Maybe that's somebody that gets really, really scared, but it's just dependent on your nervous system, your experience, right? Trauma responses are absolutely real. But a critique that I have in the world of Instagram and on the socials, as we call them, is that there are a lot of people in the wellness world that want to capitalize on this idea that everything is a trauma response. And I'm not saying that it's always ill-intended. I'm not saying that it's always wrong or inaccurate, but we really need nuance in the world of Instagram, in the world of coaching, in the world of wellness. We cannot just blanket statement X equals Y. It doesn't. And as somebody who is a therapist, but also does coaching, I have seen a lot in the coaching world this idea that everything's a trauma response, therefore everything needs healing, everything needs attention, right? It's like, it could be something so silly like, oh, if you really don't like wearing jean jackets, because I'm wearing a jean jacket right now, that's a trauma response, we have to work on it, right? Like, that feels so silly, and that's just an example that comes to me, but I see it more and more and more. It's like, just because you get activated, just because your nervous system's activated, doesn't mean it's a trauma response. Just because you notice that you get hypervigilant doesn't always mean that it's a trauma response, right? Just because you binge watch TV doesn't always mean it's a trauma response. And it's really just bringing nuance into this conversation around, when we label things always as trauma responses, who actually benefits from that? We as clients don't benefit from that, right? But it's maybe these practitioners, or maybe these healers, or maybe these coaches, or these therapists, or whoever's selling you something wants you to believe that everything is a trauma response, right? And again, I don't think it's all ill-intended, but I do think that in the world of social media and in the world of wellness, we've lost nuance. And also, there's a lot of people who are unintentionally harming and bringing unintentional harm to their communities by making these big blanket statements, which then people internalize as, uh-oh, there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with how I'm living, and I need to constantly fix it, which then creates vulnerability. And then people feel like they need to invest themselves in this program or in this thing to save them, when maybe really, yeah, maybe we have some healing to do. But when we're capitalizing off of people's pain, we have to just really pay attention to how we are intentionally or unintentionally causing harm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the whole discernment thing has to really come into play big time, because as you said, I mean, like you said, we have a lot of people they're making a lot of progress themselves, and they're becoming coaches, and maybe they're getting like certifications and stuff, which is great, but it's still difficult to still know what's real and what even is suitable for your experience personally. And yeah, it's a big one. So my next question is, being seen. And I want to mention this is because this is something that I've actually been experiencing as well, but I've also spoken to a lot of people that can relate to the being seen part, and sort of like the fears that we experience, myself, other people, and potential maybe even could be part of trauma, or maybe not having enough conversation on this, of like, is it or is it not necessarily something that is part of trauma. I think because, like, first, the idea that, being, it's actually a deep need that we all have, essentially, to be seen. So that's kind of like one thing that I've discovered and kind of learned. And then, however, when we also think of it, many of us think that being seen on a large scale is narcissist, or like you're being vain, or so it's hard to understand of like, is this something that's uncomfortable for me because it's a trauma response, or something like that, or is it because I don't want to be seen because I'm going to be, it can be like judged, fear of being judged, or it could be you see things as like you're you don't want to seem like you're too much or make other people feel uncomfortable, or things like that. And maybe we just want to be seen by loved ones or something like that. So what makes that part of us to be turned off, and what makes it feel uncomfortable and unsafe to be seen?
Yeah. So one of my favorite thought leaders in psychology is Dr. Gabor Mate. And
Same.
yeah, he's incredible.
Yeah.
So he put this idea very succinctly, which is, as children, we have two primary needs. We have the need for attachment to our caregivers, right? Because they literally give us life. If we don't have those attachment needs met, whoever the caregiver is, it doesn't have to be your biological parents, whoever's in charge of you, without them, we can't survive. But a just as important need is the need for authenticity. They're both innate in us as humans. But the need for attachment will always trump the need for authenticity when our authenticity feels like it's going to threaten getting our attachment needs met. And so an example of this is if you were a little kid and you were just this very like joyous, loud, sparkly little kid who loved to sing and dance and do it in public and do it in the living room and do it at friends' houses. And there was a lot of shaming around that. No, you don't do that. Keep it together. We don't dance and sing. Behave, right? Whatever the messaging is, if we got taught that that part was bad or wrong, we as children interpret that as, uh-oh, that part means that I'm not going to be loved. And as children, what we do so brilliantly and so painfully is that we unconsciously exile that part into the shadow. And the shadow is this part of the unconscious, as Carl Jung talked about it, as where all of our repressed parts go into hiding. Right? So a lot of the time, these parts that accumulate in the shadow aren't bad. People talk about shadow work and embracing your dark side. And like, there's all this jargon around the shadow, but really the shadow is this place where it's just your exiled parts. And so let's say that you learned that you had to get really good grades on top of you weren't allowed to sing and dance. Right? Now we have this both and. So now we go, and this is all unconscious, right? But we go, okay, not okay to sing and dance. That part's bad. That part's wrong. But when I get really good grades, my caregivers show me support, or my caregivers show me love, right? So what do? We move through our lives continuing to repress that part of ourselves that wants to sing and dance and play and be loud. And we keep feeding the part that feels like it needs to perform. And that part really becomes the defense against what our authenticity is. Right? And so as children, we need to be seen. We want to be seen. Humans need to be seen, right? But most of us weren't seen for all of ourselves. We were seen for parts of ourselves. We were seen for parts that the people that we were raised by gave us praise for. Those are the parts that we got seen for. And then as we grow up, we go, okay, so A, B, and C parts of me are lovable. And these are the parts that are worthy. My perfectionist side, being the person who's always dressed up with full makeup on is praised, whatever it is. But these parts back here, those aren't. So we have to keep hiding them, right? And as we do that, and as we keep moving through our lives, the parts in the shadow, those exiled parts, they don't just disappear. They're still there and they beg to be seen. And so from a depth-oriented perspective, they're going to show you that they want to be seen. And that's where the symptoms come. So when we experience depression, when we experience anxiety, when we experience hypervigilance or that perfectionism or the shutdown or the rage, like there's something that our psyches are wanting us to see, right? But we keep performing and we keep trying to get those attachment needs met in the same way that we were trying to get them met as children because we actually really needed them back then. We don't need them in the same way now, but we don't know the difference because we've just been surviving this way. And so Gabor Mate would say that this is the subtle trauma that happens, that he believes all of us have, is not necessarily one traumatic event, but what it means to grow up as human, right? What it means to grow up in the United States if you're here or wherever you are, right? Like what it means to grow up in a culture. And so a lot of us, most of us, didn't have our authenticity needs met fully. And then as we get older, a lot of the being seen is performative because we still believe that we need to perform in order to be seen. And there's a big difference between being transparent and being vulnerable. And I think that is something that we are seeing a lot in the world of social media right now, because when we show up and we believe we're being vulnerable, we're most likely only being transparent. We're probably not showing this deeply vulnerable thing that is like our authenticity and our soul. We're most likely sharing something that maybe feels vulnerable, but is still just a bit more surface level because it feels really scary to be vulnerable, right? And so I think that this is something in the age that we are in where people are really grappling with this. What does it actually mean to be vulnerable? What does it actually mean to be authentic? And how do I allow myself to be seen in that authenticity?
Yeah, that's awesome. The way that you put it, so perfect. What would you say, how can someone, I guess, go about making those shifts? Because it's like, obviously this is limits that it creates, from us not to show our true authentic self. And I mean, even within myself, I've been that way, and it's like it just feels so uncomfortable to have to hide that part of yourself, but it also feels very uncomfortable to come out. So what would you say could someone kind of start, or what could someone do to gradually maybe create that space and that capacity to move towards, being seen and not being so uncomfortable.
Sure. Yeah. Well, this is the holy grail question, right? Like if it was that easy, therapists wouldn't exist. um, but what I will say is that our nervous systems can't tell the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat. They don't really know the difference. Our nervous systems have been developing for 500 million years. Like they're really strong. They're really good at protecting us. And in modern day society, like we can't tell the difference between getting a negative comment on a picture we posted on Instagram from literally being chased down by a lion in the middle of the desert. Like it feels the same in the nervous system, right? And so what we have to do, and part of this nervous system work, is building the capacity to hold discomfort, because life is uncomfortable. Vulnerability is uncomfortable. Authenticity is uncomfortable. Those things aren't just, we don't just feel vulnerable and feel authentic and it's just all good, right? Like we have to stretch ourselves. And there's a lot of discomfort in that. And so my whole thing is you have to start really small. And you have to remember that your nervous system, even though it wants change, really feels comfortable in staying in what's or what feels familiar, right? So even though we want change, even though we want to be vulnerable, even though we want to be authentic, it feels so difficult because our nervous systems are like, no, that's too scary. Stay here. Stay hiding, right? At least we know that we're safe here, but we don't know if we're safe. I don't know if I can protect you if you actually show who you are, right? And so this is where the nervous system stretching comes into place. And so I'm just thinking, the first example that comes to me is a one-on-one client that I work with. And when we first started together, she came to me with an insecurity that if she wasn't constantly wearing makeup all day, every day, she was afraid that people were going to make fun of her or that she was ugly or, like she shamed herself a lot. And I wasn't like, okay, well, let's just go out and stop wearing makeup and it's fine. We had to really work up the courage of, she went on a camping trip away from the world, and there was a test of what would it be like to leave your makeup kit at home. Okay, that felt too scary. She couldn't do it. That's okay, right? So then we had to slow down even more. And then it's like, okay, well, what would it be like to not put your makeup on for the first hour of your day, right? Because the first thing she'd do is get up, go to the bathroom, go put on her makeup. So we got her to not put it on right away, right? Then as we got comfortable in that, then it was 2 hours, right? Then it was, can you go get a cup of coffee early in the morning without your makeup on, right? And more, how can you stretch? And so I'm sharing this example because people want so badly to change, but if you go too quickly, you're going to blow your nervous system and it's not going to know what to do. And then it's going to contract and it's going to go back to the thing that it knows, right? This is why so many people want to start gym memberships on New Year's, work out for maybe a week or 2 weeks and fall off, or people want to start dieting. They last a day. It's because you're blowing your nervous system past its capacity too quickly. So what would it be like to peel yourself back from the outcome of what it is that you want and go, what would it be like to just lean into that process that leads to the outcome 5%? And start there. Start small. Start smaller than you think, because your ego wants to go, no, it's fine. I got this, I'm good. but your nervous system doesn't know how to deal with it.
Yeah. And so this is definitely something that, people have to probably feel into, and obviously I would say and think that it's helpful when you have someone that can kind of guide you a little bit. So working with a professional. Um but yeah, it's a matter of like taking those baby steps and looking back, feeling what it feels like, making sure that you're feeling into your body and everything like that before you're like, okay, let me kind of go a little bit further. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
great. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, and this is the beauty of really good therapy or really good coaching or working with a practitioner that you trust, is that we can do all of the nervous system stretching that we can do alone, and that's great. But we also all have wounds that happened in relationship. Most of our wounds happened in relationship, which means that most of our healing also has to happen in relationship, because we need to actually be seen by another person who can hold all of us in a way that we haven't experienced before. That's why therapy is so powerful, because we learn to hide and we learn to contort and we learn to cut parts of ourselves off to survive. But when we have a safe space and a person that can hold all of those parts and not shame, not judge, they get curious about them and they help us process the shame and the guilt and the fear around these parts, then we can bring them into consciousness and live more authentically. But that can't happen when we are just doing it alone all the time. And that's also a defense that I see in people, right? Of
Mhm.
course, because it's scary. It's scary to open yourself up to someone because there's that fear of rejection, there's that fear of abandonment, right? But that is also why therapy is so beautiful and so effective.
Yeah, and I love that you add that layer of like in relation, because I mean, obviously that could be any, any other person, it could be a friend, it could be anything, but something that comes to mind is like the relation between you and, well, between a partner, right? Like
Mhm.
a partner that, because sometimes I hear this a lot too. It's like people will take that time to be single, and they're productive with their time because they're trying to heal and work through some things. But then, and then like you start to feel good because your nervous system is, it's
Mhm.
good, right? It's not around anyone that closely where you're being vulnerable. But then all of a sudden you enter a relationship, and then of course, you have the honeymoon phase, so things are pretty good, but then things start to slip after, once
Yeah.
that honeymoon phase, starts to, and then the real stuff kind of comes in, and your relationship to attachment or whatever it, like you said,
Mhm.
really comes into focus. And then you kind of realize like, oh wow, like these are things that I have to work on. And that can really mess with a person too, because, and then they feel like they have to completely pull back, and not realizing that being in a relationship is sometimes good, but also it is difficult because of the fact that like you have to, work through a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, our closest relationships mirror back to us the parts of us that are still wounded, right? They hold up mirrors. And when two people are in relationship together, and we're both talking about a romantic relationship, right? Or two or more people, whatever your preference is,
Mm-hmm.
um, it really is that you're not fighting with each other in this present moment, but you both come with a lot of past experiences that have shaped your nervous system into the nervous system that you have right now, right? Your nervous system doesn't just mature and age because you go through puberty and go through adulthood. Like, you have the same nervous system that you had when you were a child.
Oof, yes.
And so it's like 5-year-olds fighting with one another. And if we can get really curious and really honest with ourselves about what's actually happening beyond this thing that someone said or this thing that someone did or didn't do, and most of the times it's very small, right? But it gets activated and then it becomes way bigger than the present moment. If we can slow down and look at what's actually happening in our nervous systems, then we're actually able to begin shifting and begin changing. But what happens so often in relationships is that there's a lot of blaming. Well, you did this. This is on you. No, it's on you. Right? And it's like, whoever you're in relationship with, you are co-creating a nervous system between the two of you or the three of you or the family of you or whoever it is. Right? You have a nervous system, another person has a nervous system. You co-create the nervous system of your relationship. You're both equally responsible for that nervous system.
Yeah. And what would you say if somebody is like really triggered compared to with one person compared to like maybe another person that they had, or
Like a
yeah,
past.
like yeah, like a past person.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, I don't know. There could be hundreds of things that I say. It's really dependent on who's in front of me. But the thing that I know for sure is that there's something that this person is activating in you that is beyond just this person, that is beyond just this moment, right? And our job is to get curious about what that could be. Like, where is this in service of your own healing, of your own growth, right? And this is where we do the depth-oriented work of diving into the unconscious to see what that is. What is that activation? Why does it exist? Why is it showing up now in this relationship versus your last one, right? And that could be 100 things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the last thing that I wanted to just briefly touch on and just, I guess, get your opinion on is the, you hear about like I'm sure you've heard about like the whole like era, right? Like I'm in my soft girl era, I'm in my so and so era. And so like I can imagine, like I haven't heard it, but maybe like I'm in my healing girl era.
Sure.
And I feel like there's still this glamorized, misguided healing, and maybe I'm wrong, and like maybe healing can look differently for different, I mean, obviously it looks different for different people, but there's still, I feel like this notion that like healing is like, I think you said in the beginning, it's like where girls are putting on like their face masks and they're like doing their, their journaling of like their gratitude, and that's what's considered, I mean, again, it could be considered, I suppose, as healing. But what happens when you start to kind of dig deeper and not realize how difficult it could be, how lonely it could be, how confusing, how all sorts of things that maybe like start to pop up that you didn't even realize were in the subconscious, and how difficult it is. So I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of the dilemma of the time that we're in, right? Like on one hand, I'm so happy and comforted that the world of healing is expanding and that people are beginning to see it and people are beginning to prioritize mental health and psychological well-being. And that feels really important. And at the same time, when something becomes as mainstream as therapy and mental health is becoming, because all these, billionaire or $1 billion tech companies are now supporting these platforms where people can get therapy, and they're not supporting therapists in
Yeah,
that.
true. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, yeah. It really is now being monopolized and capitalized on in a way that I think anybody who, like, as a practitioner who takes this work really seriously is going, no, like, this is harmful and this is going to cause damage too. And so we're holding this tension of, it's so good that more people are waking up to this need for inner work. And it is kind of scary and is becoming a monster in its own way. The shadow of the wellness world is only getting bigger right now.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I love that people are doing things like face masks and gratitude journaling. Like, I think that's great and I think that's important. But there can be this overglamorization of the healing journey, which leads to even more confusion for people who are feeling in the depths of their soul, right? Like, we know that true healing pushes the edges of comfort. It's going to bring up all of the parts of us that have been deeply terrified. It's bringing them to the surface, and now we have to consciously feel them. I want to say a blanket statement that maybe I'll regret one day, but it's like, if we're not feeling uncomfortable in this journey, we're not doing enough. And if you're just doing things that are under this guise of healing, but you're never actually being with yourself and processing the old pain and getting uncomfortable and feeling that level of overwhelm, then there's probably something deeper happening. And so it's this both and of like, I never want to shame somebody for their journey and their experience. And after my hundreds and hundreds of clients that I have seen, I will tell you that the healing journey isn't always pretty.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't always feel good, right? But the anticipation of the journey is often a lot scarier than actually being in the journey. And I think that's a misconception that people also have.
Yeah, I love that you say that because again, like I'm not saying it to shame anyone or to judge, but
Yeah.
it's just, I take it very serious and I'm like, gosh, like I feel like I've just went through hell and
Yeah.
it's something that like I want to encourage people to enter the world of healing and the path, the journey of healing. But I also want to show like the realistic side of things as well, like not
Yeah.
the glamorized sort of idea and fantasy of it, but also I don't want to scare people to the point that they don't want to go through that path because it's one of those things where like you have to go through like the really really dark aspect of things and then you start to see the light at the end of the tunnel eventually and you'll be like, wow, this is so worth it, what I'm experiencing from the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why being in relationship with a therapist or a practitioner is so important, because it's too scary to do this alone. We need support, right? We need another safe nervous system to help guide the way, to lead the way. And this is why I'm a huge believer in people getting support. It feels so important, because if we're doing things under the guise of healing that may be more under the guise of self-care is great. Self-care can look like a multitude of ways, but journaling and face masking, those things are great, but they're self-care. It's not this active process. And where we're not actively processing, we're still denying. And so as a therapist, people don't come to session and then pull out a gratitude journal and face mask. That's not what's happening in the room with me.
Yeah.
They're after. They're doing that after, to come back down, to take care of themselves, right? but the process is deeper and is messier.
Yeah, for sure. Nadia, thank you so much for joining me today. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you so
And
much.
and to finish off, is there anything that I'm going to include all your information in the description box? But I guess, are you working on anything special in particular that's coming up, or anything that you would wish to add before we close?
Yeah, sure. So if you're interested in working with me, I have both one-on-one options and group healing options. I'm actually getting ready to launch my last group healing container. It's called Journey into the Mature Feminine. It's a 12-week group healing container, which is focused on holistic, soul-led healing, inner child healing, shadow work, and coming home to your authenticity. And so if you have been desiring a more holistic method, like if you've tried therapy, traditional talk therapy, and it doesn't feel like right, it hasn't resonated, you still feel like there's something missing, Journey into the Mature Feminine is really this beautiful container of women who are all soulful, who are all there to share the same intention, the same journey of coming back to themselves fully. And so that starts in November, and I still have a couple spots open for that. And if you're listening to this beyond November, then reach out to me and we can see what I have coming up.
Awesome. That's so amazing to hear. And I love, like, I found you on Instagram and I really love all your posts and everything like that. So
Thank
definitely,
you.
it's great. Yeah. All right, Nadia. Well, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and night.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Um,